Hold it. Ferrari's just made things absolutely clear. This explains everything. Toto didn't leak the news about Lewis going to Ferrari directly. Ferrari did it themselves. Well, this explains a lot of things, and not to mention it actually frees up Ferrari to do what's best for Lewis in 2025, but there's more to it. If you're confused as to what I'm going on about, I wouldn't blame you. But the simple matter is that the whole shebang regarding Lewis going to Ferrari back in February has now since been cleared up, with Ferrari's team principal Fred Vasseur going into detail as to the machinations behind the reveal. You would think that would have been the case, that Ferrari would want to introduce something as big as Lewis Hamilton arriving at Ferrari towards their adoring audience, and instead, Toto has decided to take that idea and run it with Kimi Antonelli. Him basically going, you dropped the ball there, Ferrari, I'm going to take the wind out of your sails by releasing Kimi to the world. For the longest time, people were reckoning that Ferrari were caught on the back foot and had to rush out a confirmation, rather than having a big announcement akin to when they dropped the 2023 Ferrari in front of lucky members of the Tifosi, and then showed it going around their test track as well in a grand display of confidence, which proved to be undeserved given that Ferrari finished behind Mercedes. The overarching consensus for the longest time was that something had to have gone down behind the scenes, that something was really incredibly fishy. Some publications were even musing the idea that Toto was the one that leaked the news about Lewis leaving to the media, that he took the news badly and allowed the news to seep out towards the public after hearing about Lewis leaving 48 hours beforehand. Yes, I will admit, the way that Toto and Mercedes handled it wasn't exactly elegant. People arriving in Brackley for some big important news. Apparently, there were Mercedes employees talking on WhatsApp to journalists and whatnot, saying that they were brought in for a hush-hush meeting and they couldn't talk about things, but it sounded pretty bad. The little things were quite damning, so you can fault Toto Wolff for not handling the breakup news very well, but in regards to leaking the news, no. This was all confirmed eventually. It turns out that this was the plan all along. It just so happened that Mercedes didn't handle it as well as they could have done, and it didn't really help that the British media were onto them quite well, because according to Fred Vasseur, this was planned weeks beforehand, which I shall convey to you right here. Ahem. If you have a look at the first part of the season, considering the fact that he also missed Jeddah, he was doing very well. Carlos. He is very professional, very consistent, and it was part of my motivation at the beginning of the year to do the announcement quite early to have him focused. I knew that at some stage he would have to sign somewhere, and this could be a distraction, but it was much better to anticipate it. But honestly, the approach of Carlos is mega professional, and he was mega professional from day one this season, as he was last year. I can compare the two on his behaviour. He's talking about Carlos and Charles. He then goes on to actually talk about the Belgian Grand Prix and how Carlos conducted himself better than Charles in a way, which is really confusing as well, but that's not the point of today's video. But go and have a look at the article. I'll leave a link in the pinned comment. It's kind of intriguing. When you look at Fred's comments on the surface, they seem perfectly reasonable. Any F1 team will want their drivers, regardless of whether they'll be there next year or not, to be racing to the best of their ability without distraction to bag the team as many points as possible. Breaking the news to Carlos this early, weeks before the February the 1st announcement, was a very bold move and very unlike most teams and drivers. Their experience is happening during the summer break usually, or at least towards the end of May or something like that. So there is some time to do something about it. It did mean that Sainz knew exactly where he stood amongst the organisation, and he could then take things from there on his own back. And therefore, he could then drive the socks off of that car to really make a statement to all concerned that he was a really good driver, and regardless of this news and a blow to his hopes of getting a title with Ferrari, he could still do the job anyway. And as Fred points out, it worked like a charm, and had the Spaniard been present for Jeddah, it would have meant that there would have been a real likelihood he would have been ahead of Charles in the championship by the time the teams rocked up to Europe. Sounds perfectly reasonable, yeah? But here's where we need to do some critical thinking and evaluate the statement that Fred gave out. Now this, my friend, is quite important. In this case, there is a lot of critical thinking to be had here, and much like my history teacher during A-level, Mr. Wright said, you have to evaluate. Yeah, he actually said it that way. No, that wasn't me embellishing. Sure, Carlos knowing the score before the season began does clear things up a little for all concerned, but it also has some consequences as well, which do not benefit the driver in question entirely. And you never really saw Carlos getting aggressive or defensive or just, vague or oblique. No, he just answered things very cleanly, bluntly, and professionally. Fred is right in that regard. Carlos did handle himself very well, considering that, hey, Ferrari basically dumped him for a better model. And especially surrounding the fact that his appendix was about to give out on him, and that news was not something that Ferrari could have predicted, and it just made things even better for them. The resulting win in Melbourne was an added bonus for all concerned, because Carlos gained ethereal levels of praise from everywhere, including Christian Horner, him casually flirting with him regarding a seat, and Ferrari looked like the ones to be going after Red Bull. They were the second best team, and not by much actually, it was very close, and Carlos, surprisingly, was the one to be leading the charge. And what made things even more impressive is that Ferrari looked like they'd finally gotten their act together. They had a really competent car, the management structure looked really clean and solid, there didn't seem to be any dramas going on behind the scenes. And that was amidst all of the scandals breaking out amongst the upper echelons of Red Bull at the time. You know, there was a lot of instability going on at Red Bull, and arguably there still is, albeit slightly different topics, but Ferrari, they looked relatively stable. It seemed to fire up the driver in question rather than completely demoralise them. And needless to say, the resulting consequences for the Ferrari company itself, even though it likes to keep the Scuderia apart separate, well, not anymore now because it does make a lot of money when compared to the 90s and 2000s, it speaks a lot of volumes because Ferrari put out their first quarter report. This would be the first quarter report that actually takes Ferrari's news about Lewis Hamilton into account, and the news and numbers are quite good. They saw an increase in terms of car sales and parts sales as well as sponsorship agreements up 10% in their respective sectors already, months before Lewis even arrives in Maranello. Even back in February, the timing of the news was almost perfect when announcing Ferrari's final 2023 report, which saw its stock price rise like crazy, adding hundreds of millions of dollars to Ferrari's inherent value. And believe me, Ferrari's value, especially the Scuderia F1 team, it will continue to skyrocket. I bet you, Ferrari, with Lewis and Charles Leclerc at the helm, two of the most high-profile social media influencers on the F1 grid, will drive the value of that team up past $5 billion. At first, Fred's plan did work for Carlos in terms of clearing his head, knowing where he stood, and then he could do the business of trying to find a seat elsewhere, which in theory at the beginning of the season looked relatively easy. But ultimately, when you actually stop to evaluate and think about it, the decision to announce this much earlier than usual benefits Ferrari more than it benefits Carlos, especially when you look at the situation with a heap of hindsight. You might think that this is obvious, but the fact of the matter is that after the opening act of the season was over and the buzz around the Lewis news had died down somewhat, when we get to the European leg of the season, the balance of power transfers away from Carlos and back towards Charles again, since, you know, he's the one that's staying. And after the Japanese Grand Prix, Sainz then finished behind his teammate in every single race, save for the Austrian and British Grand Prix, where mechanical gremlins and abysmally bad pit stop calls played a part in Leclerc having a terrible triple header. You know, the 3 races where Charles Leclerc only scored 12 points, and that was only 1 point more than Sergio Perez, and he had a mardy of a time, and then Nico Hülkenberg scored 4 points more, and it just makes me think, oh man, if only in 2013 Ferrari signed Hülkenberg instead of just keeping Massa on for another year, this would have been a completely different timeline. And in a way, you could say that Ferrari had their fill of Carlos and they just decided, okay, you've had enough fun, it's time for Charles to take the reins again. Because seriously, the results play for themselves. Charles has had a slightly better time of it, whereas Carlos hasn't. Another way you could interpret this whole idea of telling Carlos much earlier than usual, was to firmly put the onus on his future away from Maranello squarely. As far as Ferrari were concerned, they were doing him a service, taking away any sense of doubt regarding contracts and putting the ball in his court for many months. This kind of attitude would benefit both parties quite well by the time you get to somewhere like September or October. May I remind you what happened at McLaren in 2012, with tensions between McLaren and Lewis Hamilton reaching boiling point, the announcement of him going to Mercedes arrives, and everything calms down again. It allows clarity from both parties to then just move on with their lives, whereas doing it early, yes, of course, it gets the initial short-term issues out of the way, but that depends on the actual driver finding a seat. And as we know, this has been one of the most protracted driver negotiation periods that we've ever seen, especially in modern F1. In my honest opinion, this whole chicanery, all it did was allow Ferrari to wash its hands of being responsible for Carlos's future. It's up to him where he chooses to go, and how he chooses to handle the business of securing the seat, which at the beginning of the year looked relatively straightforward, and it wasn't affecting Carlos at all. But arguably, you could say that it has been affecting him ever since we got back to Europe. By the time you get to the Spanish Grand Prix, both Ferrari and Carlos were having to field questions about their respective futures almost every single day. In the sake of Carlos, it's like, have you made a decision yet, Carlos? And then he just goes, no, guys. And then when it comes to Ferrari, Fred's having to just swat away the media by saying, we're not fielding questions about that. And even Lewis is now just getting questions, and he actually gets sick and tired of it. And he just says, haven't you got any more questions? You remember that soundbite? All three parties were getting absolutely bored stiff with all of the stuff surrounding the futures of their respective parties. But again, at the same time, it wasn't really Ferrari's fault because, hey, Carlos is the one that's causing all the friction, at least in their minds. And let's be real, Ferrari were already dealing with a mountain of criticism and derision by falling at the first hurdle when it came to the beginnings of a development war, with the porpoising coming back with a bite, something of which we did not see coming at the beginning of the year. And therefore, understandably, the decision about where is he going to go would be weighing heavily on Carlos's mind, because there's a real chance that he might not end up with an F1 seat at all, and he would either have to take a year out or that's his song written. And when you stop to look at it, now that he's actually signed a deal with Williams, the decisions that he was having to deal with would have been extremely intense. And I do apologize if I was getting a little bit frustrated, but I'm pretty sure that he was frustrated as well. We were just echoing how he felt probably. Because the prospects of Audi, which looked fairly decent about a year or so ago, looked entirely different by the time he got to the Spanish Grand Prix because, well, Sauber weren't doing anything really well. Andreas Seidel was showing that he wasn't really being effective. Audi wasn't quite sure what they were going to do, whether or not they were going to fully commit. They were making such big, grandiose promises to him that probably wouldn't be able to be kept. And then you got Alpine throwing their hat in the ring with all of their hopes and dreams of glory, which have yet to materialize as they're on the decline as well. And then you had the idea of Carlos going to Red Bull and Mercedes. They would try their best, but ultimately it just fell on deaf ears because Mercedes had their own plans. And then Christian Horner, he don't want Carlos back. He got his fill with Carlos with the whole negotiations getting rid of Renault engine power. And with every week that passed, the memories of the Australian Grand Prix and his triumphant return to Formula One after surgery just became a distant memory. And what became the constant was that Charles Leclerc would be the one most likely to be the lead Ferrari driver by the time the checkered flag wove on Sunday. But in the canny mind of Fred, as well as Scuderia Ferrari, that's not their problem anymore. As long as they bring a car that can race to the best of its ability for Carlos, then that's all they gotta do. They've just got to give him what he needs to provide some success and get them points as well, especially now Mercedes are starting to kick on, and third place in the Constructors could actually be Ferrari's to lose. But at the same time, Ferrari have to be really grateful that Carlos was able to handle himself on the day with a sense of decorum, and he did not allow himself to get too frustrated with the predicament that he was finding himself in. It could have affected his performances even worse than it already did. And in a way, you could also think that Carlos was feeling a little bit grateful for Ferrari, considering that they were having to deal with their porpoising problems, having to roll back months of technical developments just to try and get a good baseline, and then their technical director leaves, they don't get Adrian Newey. The prospects of Ferrari being a super team looked slightly more complex and complicated. Now, the cause of Carlos's slump could be numerous, but I think two things that would not be attributed to it is the fact that Lewis Hamilton was replacing him, and the fact that he wasn't able to get a title with Ferrari, let alone actually fighting for one. Sainz is mature and smart enough to make peace with the fact that if you were going to be replaced by someone, that it better be one of the most decorated F1 drivers in its entire history. And even though Sainz does appear arrogant in reckoning that he is better than Lewis, he does counter that with everyone else in the grid will probably say the same thing when asked, because, you know, you need to think that you could be the best to even make it in F1, which does make sense in terms of personal reassurance. Now, another facet to this, and why what Fred Vasseur just said explains a whole lot of things, is the other news that's been attached that surrounds Lewis Hamilton's arrival at Ferrari, and something that I sort of have to walk back from a previous video. I didn't think that Ferrari were prepared, but you know what? This news from Formula Uno makes me have to retract that and think, okay, that does make a lot of sense. Maybe they are a little bit more prepared than I thought. Supposedly, Sainz was told the news about him leaving weeks ahead of the February reveal, which goes hand in hand with what Williams' James Vowles said that talks between he and him began with his bestie back in December of last year. What this meant is that the bods of Ferrari knew exactly what the lineup for 2025 was going to be. If it wasn't going to be the constant of Sainz and Leclerc, then they knew it was going to be Hamilton and Leclerc. And it means that they could actually take their time to study what Lewis Hamilton's driving style is all about. And according to Charles Leclerc, the current golden boy of Ferrari, the arrival of Lewis Hamilton, as well as his insight and experience, will be reassuring. And again, according to Formula Uno, who's usually accurate when it comes to news about Ferrari especially, the team is well into developing next year's Ferrari car and taking some things into consideration that are not present on the SF24. And as the publication points out, that is going to require a major change when it comes to the concept of the overall car. And given the fact that we are going into 2025, the last year of this current set of regulations, and a whole new regulation system will be in for 2026, you think this would be an incredible waste of time. That why wouldn't you just stick with what you've already got and just adapt it from there as best you can? Which does make sense. But then again, you're getting Lewis Hamilton. You want to make the most of your investment, considering that Ferrari, the company, is dropping nearly $500 million on the guy. You want him to be as effective as possible on day one, minute one of practice one. And with the news of Hamilton becoming clear to everyone at Maranello much earlier, around about the holidays of 2023, it meant that work could commence in terms of the overall concept of the 2025 entry, dubbed Project 677, months before that anyone could have expected. And especially since work on the 2026 car has been banned until New Year's Day of 2025. So what else have the people that are working on future cars have got to do, eh? So why not just work on an idea that could work with Lewis and Charles? Changes that Formula Uno muses could lead to changes to the cockpit, the overall balance of the car, as well as major chassis modifications to cater the move to a new suspension model, all of which would benefit Lewis and are comments he has made publicly. And this is something that has just made me really think about all of the comments that Lewis made regarding the W14 last year. Do you recall throughout most of the year, Lewis was sounding off about what he did not like about the Mercedes concept and exactly what needed to be done to fix it, and then we get the W15, which, after some further development, actually works for him and has bagged him 2 wins this year? Well, I think this was not something that he was just trying to air out the dirty laundry and vent his frustration. I personally think this might have been a bit of a sounding off toward Ferrari about, hey, I don't like this kind of concept. If you want me to do well in your car, Scuderia and Fred, then why don't you just change some things? I don't think that Ferrari would have been ignoring exactly what Lewis was saying, especially if the rumours were true that John Elkann and he were talking about moving to Ferrari as early as Monaco 2023. Again, foam of doubt right here. This is just me with my tinfoil hat theory, but just think about it, okay? Because this would be the most efficient and legal way of talking to Ferrari without breaking your contract regarding secrecy. And you could also argue that Lewis and Charles have been seen talking to one another much more since they announced that they were going to become teammates in 2025. Which is understandable since they would want to acquaint themselves beforehand, but I wouldn't be surprised that behind closed doors, away from the cameras, Charles and Lewis would be talking about what they're finding good and not so good about their respective cars. No, they're not exactly trading secrets or anything, because I'm pretty sure that Charles would not be just blurting out secrets about the Ferrari car, so that means Mercedes could benefit from it, and vice versa. But they could easily talk about what they like in terms of the fundamentals regarding the current season's machinery. And Lewis has actually publicly said that he does not get along with this concept of car at all. The ground effect era cars, they're just things that he finds extremely frustrating, and he just cannot get a handle on them in qualifying, which then makes his lot in the race even harder. So that's just clear messaging to Ferrari that, hey, just give me a car that I can do well in qualifying in and I'll be good to go. And of course, you just have to look at what Lewis is doing in the current W15 and the fact that Mercedes really likes to overshare about their situation. Andrew Shovlin and all that lot, they constantly go to the media and say, well, according to our studies, this is exactly what is wrong with the W15 and this is what we've done to correct it. You know, transparency and wanting to share their development. Do you really think that the teams are not listening to that as well and then just taking notes? And besides, I think Lewis and Charles are professional enough and wise enough to not pull a Spygate or anything like that, sharing secret and sensitive documents. No, they'll be just taking their insights from what they've learnt in their head towards their respective teams. It's what Adrian Newey did all the time. Even though he was told to go on gardening leave, not take any more notes, he'd have to leave all of his schematics behind at the team that he was leaving, he still had the ideas in his head. He would then write about it or just draw it at home, and then it'd be ready when he does go into work at the new team to then just go, hey, this is what I was doodling while I was on gardening leave. And Leclerc could telegraph these thoughts to the engineers like a shopping list, alongside his own wants and needs for the 2025 car. Therefore, by the time Lewis does arrive in Italy to get started with simulator work and pre-season testing, he's got a car which is already well on the way to be something he can work with. All this means is that it gets months of development and guesswork out of the way. It means that by the time we rock up to the Australian Grand Prix next year, The car that Ferrari brings is something that Lewis is relatively happy with. Make the most of it from the very first race, instead of just having to wait by the time you get to the middle of the season when he does have a car that can work with, and especially with the chassis. If the chassis works well with him from the beginning, it makes upgrading that car a heck of a lot easier. And I know this is a lot of effort for 2025, especially with 2026 on the horizon and a brand new concept change again. But Ferrari has contracted Hamilton for 3 years. Do they really want him to just sit on his hands and just go, well, the car's not that great this year, well, I'll just wait until next year. Yeah, of course, he's getting money, but I'm pretty sure that Ferrari and Lewis will want to win races straight from the get-go. So yes, Fred's idea to drop the news about Lewis and Carlos does make sense, for the team mostly, and it benefits mostly the team. It did allow Carlos to start work early in finding a team, and allow him a little bit more choice in terms of options, but I don't think I've ever seen such a cumbersome and protracted negotiation journey, which probably costs other drivers valuable time in securing their own futures as well. It's been mad. You remember the phrase that Kevin Magnussen said about Carlos Sainz likening him like a cork to a bottle? It just prevented other drivers from making moves because they didn't know where Carlos was going to go. And now Carlos has decided exactly where he's going to go. All the other drivers are scrabbling around trying to find a seat and secure their future, and most likely we might see drivers losing their seats that might have had an opportunity had Carlos made his mind up in the traditional sense. Or maybe people could have just made their minds up a little bit sooner. And I think another side effect that has manifested itself is that a lot of goodwill towards Carlos Sainz that he had at the beginning of the year, most of it has somewhat gone due to his indecision and just the way things went. But again, that's not Ferrari's problem. They've got Lewis and Charles to deal with, and that in itself will be challenging, but it could also have some very good rewards. That was a clever move, Fred, but what was not so clever were the moves conducted by a certain Pierre Gasly. He thinks he's getting one thing, but then it becomes painfully obvious that it's become a completely different thing, with no get-out options. To find out more about why I think that him staying with Alpine was a bit of a mistake, a terrible mistake at that, go and watch this video next, and I shall see you there.